Okay, welcome everyone to our Genealogy Club. Tonight we're welcoming Earle back to talk about researching newspapers. Earle is a tenured member of the library faculty at Greenlee Library at Farmingdale State College. In addition to her primary role as the cataloger, she provides reference service and information literacy instruction. She received both her master's in library science and Master of Arts in public history from St. John's University, where she now teaches as an adjunct course. She now teaches an adjunct course on genealogical sources and services in their Division of Library and Information Science. With over 30 years of genealogy experience, her real joy is helping others discover their family histories and bringing to light the history of our college. Her work helps people connect to the past in a more personal way through the stories of those who have gone before us. So welcome, Earle. Thank you for being with us.
Of course. Thanks for having me this evening. So this is using newspapers in your genealogy research. I like to tell everyone a little bit about me. Like Erin said, I've been doing this genealogy research for more than 30 years. That number is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So I just put that little plus on the end there, and I'm just never going to change that. 30 is enough. I am an academic librarian in my full-time job, but I like to tell people how I got started doing genealogy research. When I was a preteen, I went to a family reunion for the Losi family, which was Grandpa Earle's mother's family. And while we were there, Grandma Earle's brother Richard showed up with his family. And I thought, oh, they're not Losis, but that's nice, that we invite the whole family. And my grandma said, oh no, Aunt Jeanette, Uncle Richie's wife, she's a Losi. And I got really confused how that could be. And so I asked them, I said, like, oh, did Uncle Richie and Aunt Jeanette introduce the two of you, or did Grandma and Grandpa introduce, Jeanette and Richard? And they said, oh no, Uncle Richie brought home his fiance for an engagement party. And while they were there, my grandpa asked Jeanette what her last name was, and she said Losi. And my grandpa said, that's my mother's last name. And they sat down and tried to figure out how they were related, which they still couldn't explain to me. But it turned out that my grandpa, who we call Poppy, and Aunt Jeanette were second cousins. Most of you probably know that that means they had great-grandparents in common. So I have this set of cousins who are my third cousins, and no, my second cousins and my fourth cousins, depending on which side of the tree you go down. Now, if you're confused, then you can understand why I did this research. And then it just never stopped, because if you've been doing genealogy research for any length of time, as soon as you answer one question, you have 10 others. Now you have to find out all these other answers. So I blame Aunt Jeanette for my genealogy habit. Today, we're going to talk about newspapers. Basically, why you use newspapers, the aim of your research. I'll give you some examples of the power of using newspapers in your research that come straight from my own research. We'll talk about where you can find newspapers, how to access electronic ones, including subscription databases and freebies out there. And then I'll talk a little bit about preserving your newspaper clippings, because if you're anything like my family, you come across all these little scraps of newspaper in amongst your family photos and stuff. I have a few words about that. So why exactly are you doing all this research on your family? I want you to think about it. Like, what really is your aim? Is your goal just to fill out this pedigree chart, put everybody's name and dates in there? Is that the goal? You just want to fix this headstone, put some names on there, and maybe collect the data of when they were born and when they died? Is that where it ends? Or what you're really looking for, is it the story? Do you really want to know who they were and what they lived through? Because if that's the case, if you want to know the story, you want either oral history, which is my big thing is oral history, or you want something in print. So I'm going to show you an example of how looking at newspapers taught me so much more about my ancestors. This here is my great-great-grandfather, Victor Henry II. He was born in New York City in June of 1874. I was born 100 years later. He died on June 23rd, 1908. Now, that was the day before Grover Cleveland died. So that's something to think about in a little bit. But after I had looked through all the census records I could find for Victor, I was still struggling to find information about him. So then I started looking for those vital records. Like, could I get a birth certificate? Well, in 1874 in New York City, they didn't require a birth certificate, so there wasn't one for him. But there was a marriage record from 1895, and there was a death certificate from 1908. So I ordered it from the city of New York. They've recently made their historical vital records accessible online for free, which is an entire other discussion. But you could get this online if you wanted to. Now, I got a photocopy of it, basically. I don't know if you can read this cause of death down here, so I blew it up. What it says is gunshot wound through chest, suicide, ? So I asked my grandmother, I said, what is this? And she didn't really want to talk about it. And so I turned to newspapers to see if I could figure out what this was about. Most suicides, especially at that time, were salacious news and they were picked up. And so I wanted to see what I could learn about his passing. And this is what I found. This came from the Brooklyn Eagle, June 23rd, 1908, page 1, front page. He killed comely widow who spurned his love. Ozone Park man with wife and family wanted to elope, and refusal cost her life. After killing her, Victor Henry sent 3 bullets into his own body and soon died. And then I found this. And then this. And then this. There were others. I just kept going. So what was going on here? Well, this man, Victor Henry, my great-great-grandfather, killed this woman, Mary Hinch Cassidy, in what appears to have been scorned love, right? And he was married to this woman. And Hinch Henry, you'll notice something interesting about those 2 women if you look closely at their names. They have the same maiden name. Turns out that Mary Hinch Cassidy was Anne Hinch Henry's cousin. And there was some tension between Anne and Victor, and they had been living apart for some time, and he started to pursue Mary. At least that's what I can gather from the newspaper articles. And that's all I have from the newspaper articles. And some of it is accurate, and some of it is speculation. There's lots of gossip running through it. So now what if this had happened on June 24th and not June 23rd? Would it have made it to the front page of the Brooklyn Eagle? June 24th was when Grover Cleveland died, and the entire Brooklyn Eagle became about the life of Grover Cleveland. So in a way, I'm a little bit lucky that he did it on the 23rd and didn't wait till the next day, because now I have some information about it. But what is going on in the world is picked up by the newspaper. And Brooklyn Eagle picked up everything. It wasn't just information about Brooklyn. It was all of New York State, New York City, around the world. They were picking up news. So what can you find in newspapers? It's a lot more than just newspaper articles and scandals that you're searching for in newspapers. There are certainly articles, obituaries, and death notices, which I'd like to make a statement about the difference between obituaries and death notices. Obituaries are articles announcing a person's death and offering all sorts of biographical information. It's typically written by the newspaper staff. A death notice is a paid announcement put in by a family to the publication of their choosing, announcing that the person's died, where their funeral services are, maybe where you can make a donation. Most people don't get an obituary. Most people get a death notice, right? but an obituary is a story. This here is an obituary for Demas Desjardins. He is my great-great-grandfather. And I'm going to read this one to you. This came from the Patchogue Advance, a Long Island-based newspaper from October 13th, 1911. And it says, Demas Desjardins died at home on Avery Avenue early Monday morning in his 60th year of age, after suffering for 8 months with a complication of diseases. The funeral was held on Wednesday with services at St. Francis de Sales Roman Catholic Church at 9:30 a.m. The Reverend Father Cronin officiating, and interment was made at St. Francis Cemetery. Mr. Desjardins was born in Montreal, Canada. He was a carpenter by trade and was employed for a long time in New York, referring to the city. He had lived with his family in Patchogue for nearly 5 years. Mr. Desjardins was known to his friends here by the name Gardner, the Anglicization of his French family name. He leaves a widow and 10 children, some of whom live in the city. We've learned a lot of information from this obituary, tons of it. We know he died on a Monday, that he was 60 years old, that he had multiple diseases, that he was a Roman Catholic, that he was buried at the cemetery associated with that church. He was born in Montreal. He was a carpenter. He had lived in Patchogue for nearly 5 years. So now I know he's in Patchogue about 1907, 1906. He had 10 children. That's a lot of lines I can trace. But the most important thing that comes out of this article for me is the fact that he anglicized his surname to Gardner, which is what my mother's maiden name is, Gardner. So Desjardins means from the garden. There's no documentation of having a name change in history at this time, at this point in time. Now you go through a legal system to change your name, but back then it was pretty fluid. And that's the documentation I have of that name change. So we get obituaries, we get death notices. We also get birth announcements, right? And of course, engagement and marriage announcements. This here is taken from Newsday in October of 1948. Maybe, I don't know if you can pick out my grandma in there. You might be able to see there's one that kind of looks like me. I'll give it away. That's my grandma up there in the corner. And it reads, Earle Henry, Mr. and Mrs. Charles A. Henry, Sr. of Fenimore Avenue, East Hempstead, has announced the engagement of their daughter, Miss Claire A. Henry, and Mr. Edwin M. Earle of Merrick. Miss Henry was graduated from Hempstead High School. Mr. Earle is a veteran of 2.5 years service in the Navy. The couple plans a February wedding. I learned a lot from this. So I have learned Claire's maiden name, Claire's father's name. He is Charles A. Henry Sr., so that means she has a brother named Charles. I have the family's address, the Henry family's address, the town that Ed is from, that Claire went to high school, Hempstead High School. Ed served in the Navy, and that they had planned a wedding date for February 1949. So I have all sorts of venues to now do more research in, contacting the high school, looking for Charles, who he might have been or where he might have lived, as well as trying to hunt down a marriage record now that I have a time period. So we get those. Those are all helpful things. Then there's these abandonment notices you might run across. These are great if you can find them. So an abandonment notices is spousal abandonment. It's when a spouse leaves the couple's residence and is living somewhere else without cause, consent, or justification, with no intention to return. It's also called desertion. It's often grounds for divorce. Also, if you cannot serve divorce papers because you don't know where the person is, you have to take steps to locate that individual, and thus they put these notices in the newspaper so you could track down your missing in action spouse. So there's this one also from the Patchogue Advance, where Cyril DeForest announces that my wife, Malvina DeForest, having left my bed and board, I will not be responsible for any debts contracted by her in my name. Malvina, her maiden name was Desjardins. So she was my great grandfather's aunt. Anyway, she left Cyril, and this gives me information about where she might be in 1929. Or that she won't be with Cyril in 1930. That looks certain. So when I'm looking for that 1930 census record, I'm looking for Malvina on her own. Good to know. So you get abandonment notices. You get foreclosures and auction notices in newspapers too. So here's one from the Daily Review in Freeport, New York, which is where my Losi family was centered. This is from April 22nd, 1933, page 12. It tells you here that Louis Adler will sell at public auction on April 28th, 1933 at 9:30 a.m. at 3840 East Merrick Road, Freeport, Long Island, a Buick sedan motor, serial number, retaken from Abram Earle. That's my great grandpa, Abram. This is 1933. This is during the Depression. And so you can see that Abram is financially struggling. And that's what this is about here. So it gives you a little hint to what was economically going on in the family when you find these foreclosures and stuff in the newspaper. So we got foreclosures. We got real estate transactions, court proceedings, they're in there. Community events, right? This one I love. This again is from the Daily Review in Freeport, October 1921. Down here, you can see highlighted Abram Earle, right? But if we blow that up a little, you can see that they're talking about the Roosevelt Firemen's Band planning an event. And it lists in here Forrest Losi, Fred Losi. They played the cornet. Then Abram Earle, who, if you read further, played the clarinet. So did I. And then his other brother-in-law, Lumen Losi. So there, Abram is with his three brother-in-laws playing in the Roosevelt Firemen's Band. I know that he's associated with that fire department now. Gives me another venue for looking for information. It also makes that personal connection because I played the clarinet. In fact, Abram's clarinet was given to his son, Alan, and my cousin, Ashley, has inherited Great Uncle Alan's clarinet, so we still have it. It's kind of neat. In addition to community events, you can get social columns now. These don't exist anymore, but man, they did, and these were great. This is from the Brooklyn Eagle, 1889. And I'm looking at this one right down here where it says, William Losi of Brooklyn has been sojourning with his aunt, Mrs. Alexander Paget of Freeport. Oh, so now I know this Alexander Paget married one of these Losis in Freeport. And I can go to see if William is connected to me, which he is. This was like my third or fourth great grandfather's brother. His sister married Alexander Paget. There's business advertisements and want ads. There's criminal activity and police blotters. Like this from the Brooklyn Eagle, 1868. Highwaymen assaulted and left insensible Leonard Losi of Freeport on his way home from a recent evening event. Right? On a recent evening. Got those. You'll see ship and train arrivals and departures listed in newspapers, as well as school achievements and graduation lists and sports events. Basically, the things you see in the newspaper today were in the newspaper then. They were a little more juicy back then, though. So those are the great things you can find, and that's awesome. But where do you actually get this stuff? I'll tell you off the bat, there is no one source for everything. And it's kind of tricky sometimes to track down the newspapers that you need for your family. But there's a few things I can show you. First, newspapers existed around the world. Every community and culture had some way of distributing news at some point in their history. Some of them don't exist anymore, in that news was meant to be ephemeral. It's something that happened right now. It was transitory. It wasn't meant to last, because tomorrow there'd be new news. That's why it's made on that crappy paper, because it wasn't meant to last long, and that paper was cheap. So the quality of the paper, the fact that it's cheap and not well made, will result in all sorts of preservation issues when you're trying to save these things over time. What newspapers remain are actively being digitized, I promise you, by a multitude of institutions. Not all of them online. Not all of them are, a fraction of them are online, right? Not even a fraction. Tiny, tiny percentages online. Most of it's kept on microfilm, those newspapers that exist. And those microfilms are being digitized for our new platforms. But locating the newspapers for the community you're interested in is really the challenge. The first thing I really want you to consider is reaching out to the historical societies and the public libraries in the communities where your ancestors lived, and finding out what they have, or what that had once been published in their area. That's the fastest route to finding the titles of these journals that you need. Now I'm going to talk about some of these databases. Some of them I'll go through very quickly. Some of them I'll demonstrate a little bit for you. And there was a handout that I sent to Erin earlier today that has the URLs for everything that you're going to see here. So don't worry if I go too fast and you miss that URL. There's a list of them. We're going to talk about free newspaper databases. We're going to talk about some subscription databases that have newspapers in them. And then I'm going to highlight some of the New York ones, because we're in New York, right? But before you even start, you have to think about your search terms. Really think about the variant spellings of surnames that you've seen. Desjardins, I don't know. I've seen it spelled 500 different ways. It also comes up Gardner, spelled a dozen different ways, sometimes with an I, sometimes with an E. So when you're going to do searching for genealogy records, you have to be open to what we think of as misspellings. They're not misspellings. They're just a variant way of spelling it. Back in the day, spelling didn't count. It never counts. People didn't care how you spelled their names, as long as the check cleared. You know, as long as they could get their money, it didn't matter how you spelled it. Then came Social Security, and now don't leave the E off my last name, because then that's not me that you're talking to, right? For very modern day, people are very concerned about the spelling of their names. But in the past, it didn't matter as much. You also have to consider the time period and whether a newspaper would have even existed for the place that you're talking about. So somebody comes to me and tells me, oh, I'm looking for, you know, a death notice from the 1600s. And I'm going to think, you really think the newspaper is still around? Now, there are some that exist, but you're not going to find them like you're going to find for the 20th century, right? But the community that your ancestors came from, that's of critical importance. And I'm going to show you in a little bit how location names change. So you need to really understand the place where your people were from and understand the names that that area has had over time. So for example, this here we saw, that's my grandma, and they lived on Fenimore Avenue in East Hempstead. Anyone know where East Hempstead is? It's now Uniondale. It's important to be familiar with the community. There are these books called gazetteers. They're basically geographical directories. It's a reference source for information about places. And on the screen is the New York State Family History Research Guide and Gazetteer, put out by the New York Genealogical and Biographical Society. I have the hard copy on my shelf. I look at it all the time. I probably look at it at least once a week. When I work with somebody, I need to know the area that they're coming from. And the Gazetteer will tell you what kind of records were being collected in that area, for what extent, for what time period. So if you've never seen it, check it out. If you don't have it in your library, you need it. It's a great resource. So let's look at these free databases. Basically, if it's free, it's for me. So I'm very familiar with these. This first one, which I hope you are also familiar with, is the Family Search Research Wiki. It's kind of the web version of contacting a historical society or looking at the gazetteer about your ancestors' community. So this here is familysearch.org. If you don't have a membership, you need to get one. It's free, absolutely free. You just need to create an account. Free. You don't put any credit card numbers in or nothing. And when you do, up under the main search bar, when you sign in, you'll see there's search. And at the bottom of that list is something called the Research Wiki. You can also just Google, Family Search Research Wiki, and it'll take you to the site, but it's so much better to use from your own account. So I always recommend you in Family Search. When you click on that, you get this clickable map of the world. And if I'm going to look at, say, North America, I'm going to click down to the place where I'm going to research. Now, my Earls were from Newfoundland. Abram Earle came from Newfoundland, settled in Freeport, married into a Losi family. All these names start to be familiar in my presentations. But if we click on the country that you're interested in, you'll get what looks like a Wikipedia page, and it tells you everything you could possibly want to know about doing genealogy research on this particular place, which is Newfoundland. So over here on the right-hand side, that box, blow it up a little bit. These are the different topics that are covered in the wiki. And you'll see, ooh, they got a whole section on newspapers. So when you click on that, it takes you to a more specific section about Newfoundland, Labrador newspapers. You'll see online resources. Some of them, like this one right here, will tell you that this is accessible through Ancestry. That little $sign means you need to have a subscription to use Ancestry. Now, if you're using it in your public library and they have a library edition of Ancestry, not all public libraries do. I'm not sure Oceanside does, but if you do, you could be in that library, have Ancestry open, click on that link, and it'll take you directly into searching that record set. An amazing utility. They also have ones that are in Family Search. See, this one here is free on Google News. There's all sorts of things, but tell people all the time, it's not a matter of clicking buttons. You really have to read. You have to read to get the information you want. Did I hear a question? Did I have a question? Okay. The next one is Chronicling America. This is put out by the Library of Congress. It was sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities, or NEH. It covers historic newspapers from about 1777 to about 1963. It has something called the U.S. Newspaper Directory. It helps you find information about American newspapers that have existed. It doesn't have them digitized, the directory. It just tells you what exists. So it claims to have 19.9 million pages plus. I'm going to tell you how many pages these places have, because at one point there's one of them that just blows my mind. So 19.9. This is it. Now you could search in this search bar for a key term up here. But you should always use advanced search. Don't ever search from the search. Always go to the advanced search. You get many more options. So once you click on advanced search up there, you get a screen that looks like this. It allows you to choose the state you're looking for. You can even go and pick the name of the newspaper. You don't have to fill out all these fields, but you put your keywords in down here. You click search, pulls back some stuff for you. But I'm going to show you this newspaper directory because this is cool. You can also get to it from this page right over here, newspaper directory. Click on that. And again, you can search by state or keywords. I'm going to put in New York, Queens, Astoria, because some of my gardeners lived in Astoria. I want to see what they have. When I click on that, I get a whole list, all 6 titles that they have based in Long Island City or Astoria, Queens, of titles. Now I'm just picked one at random. So this one in red here, I'm going to show you more of what happens when you click on a link. This is for the Astoria Herald and Newtown Gazette. It covers from 1863 to something. They don't have an end date on this. When you click on it, what you get is a record. Oh, and you can't see I can't see the bottom of my screen there. So it just tells you what this is. This is not where you search for it. There's no search box here. This is just telling you what libraries have it. And if you click on this view complete holding information, I blew that up so you could see what that says. It takes you to this page. This is awesome. This tells you exactly the library that has this title and what they cover, what volumes, what issues. You'll notice though, when was the last time this was updated? So it might not be accurate, but it's also held by Queensborough Public Library. So maybe I can't search in this particular newspaper, but I can get access to it by contacting these libraries and finding out how to use it, whether they've digitized it, maybe it's only on microfilm. Maybe the only way for me to use it is to actually go to the library. That kind of can be a pain if you're talking about an area you don't live near, but Queensborough Public Library is not too far from me. I gotta go check that out. But that's how that directory works. It's pretty amazing because it covers every corner of the country for the entire extent of our history, at least until the 1960s. There's also Google Books and Google News. If you use Google Books, it's looking for more historic items. If you use Google News, you're looking at more recent obituaries, right? So this is Google Books, right? Let's say I put my search term in there, Leonard Losey, right? Gonna look for Leonard. Most people don't know if you put quotation marks around it, it makes the system treat that like it's one word, treats that empty space like it's a character all its own. So now it's only going to bring back Leonard Losey's when they're right next to each other. If you do that, I get back all sorts of Leonard Losey's, but you'll see like it's Leonard Losey right next to each other, Leonard Losey. But these actors directories and stuff, this is not what I'm looking for. Up here underneath any document, you can limit it to newspapers. You can now see what's existing on the web through Google of newspapers that list a Leonard Losey in there. I did find my Leonard Losey, but not in the top hits here. He's a couple pages in. That's how you use Google Books to find newspaper articles. Now there are these subscription databases, which I'm not going to show you too much detail about, but I'll tell you, if you subscribe to these databases, they do have access to some newspapers. So newspapers.com seems the most obvious. This is owned by Ancestry. It's accessible through many public libraries. It has 783 million pages. That's a lot. It has over 24,000 newspapers from across the United States, mostly United States. I do believe there are some other countries in there, Canada as the one that pops to mind. There's ancestry.com, which again is accessible through many public libraries. They have the library edition. They have a little over 1,300 titles that are accessible that do not require the subscription to newspapers.com. So if you have a subscription to ancestry.com, you can still find newspapers in it without subscribing to newspapers.com. To do that, there are filters in there on the left-hand side where you can limit your search results to newspaper results. Find My Past, which has a UK and Ireland focus, have partnered with the British Newspaper Archives. So if you're doing research on England or Ireland, you might try looking in Find My Past. Again, that is a subscription database, so you pay to get access to that. There's Genealogy Bank, has over 15,000 newspapers from all 50 states. Every database will have something different than the other database, right? Everyone will have something a little different. There's MyHeritage, which claims to have over 2 billion newspaper records, but really is only 104 newspapers in their collection. That 2 billion is all the pages that they've replicated from those 104 newspaper collections. And then there's Newspaper Archive, which says it has 16,059 publications from over 3,447 cities around the world. It's free to search the historical collection, but the searching for the newspaper is free. The newspaper, not the actual article. To get access to the actual article, you need a subscription. Kind of sneaky like that, but you can determine if the newspaper you want is in there for free before you subscribe. And then there's the New York newspapers. These I use a lot. My Losi family line has been in the United States since the 1630s, and so I do a lot of New York research. My first and one of my favorites is this New York historicnewspapers.org. It provides free online access to New York-based newspapers. It has 11.7 million pages available. And I have found some great stuff in there. Some of the articles I showed you, I pulled out of this database. Then there's the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, which is one of my favorites. It was published in Brooklyn from 1841 till 1955. It covers 114 years of the history of New York City. It's fun to note that our nearby celebrity, Walt Whitman, we have a building on my campus here at Farmingdale named after him, was editor of the Brooklyn Eagle for 2 years. The Brooklyn Public Library maintained this as an online archive. Sorry about that. Which was purchased by Ancestry for newspapers.com many years ago. And when they sold it to Ancestry, they insisted that it be freely accessible. So even though it's run by newspapers.com, it's completely free to access and use. And it has 1.4 million pages available. Then there is this is the one that blows me away. This is FultonHistory.com. It's mostly New York State, some other states, there's some Canada records in there, but it's operated by one man, Tom Trinsinski of Fulton, New York, who started this in about 1999 with a collection of digitized postcards. He has 51.6 million pages in there. 51.6 million. It's huge. It's a little janky. It's like, if you remember how to use the internet back in the 1990s, early 2000s, it looks like that still. You put your search term in, you get this jumbly list of things, but man, I have found some gems in that. So those are the databases you should consider looking in for newspaper articles. The other thing about that, like I said, there is no one database that's going to have all the newspapers there, and not any single one of them will guarantee that you'll have access to information on your people. You have to know where your people came from to figure out where their information is. But I do want to say something about preservation. What do you do with all those yellowing newspaper clippings that you find in your family's records? So there are 4 aspects of dealing with newspapers: scraps, clippings, storage, handling, housing, and display or sharing. So storage like where you're going to keep all your scraps, you want to keep it in a cool, dry location to prevent the growth of mold or the damage by sunlight. Hot conditions, if you keep it in your attic in the heat in the summer, that accelerates the yellowing and the embrittling of paper. As that paper gets old, it's going to start to crumble. We all know that. So when you do handle your clippings, you want to make sure that you avoid chipping brittle paper, right? You want to use clean hands, no lotion. Lotion on your hands will cause stains on that newspaper. It's absorbent like a paper towel. You want to store things flat. You don't want to fold things because those folds will become where the creases, that's where they'll come apart in the future. If you start to unfold something and it starts to break, just stop. Stop right away, because you're only going to lose all that. Also, do not use glue or tape. You want to make sure what you're using against your resources is acid free. And that's when we're going to talk about housing your stored stuff, right? Housing, I mean those boxes that you're going to keep it in. You want to make sure you're using archival quality things that are acid free, such as folders or boxes. They have full size, if you have full size sheets of the newspaper, they should be stored flat. And you should always store the big things on the bottom and build like a pyramid to the smaller things on top. Your little clippings go on top, your big pages go on the bottom. Because if you stack it in some other way, the big things will start to curve over the little things. That's called slumping. And that can cause additional damage when you try to straighten that thing out. Attempts to fold things will cause breakage. Said that. You don't want to intermingle things with your newspaper clippings. You don't want letters and photos in with your newspaper clippings, because the impurities in that newspaper print will permanently stain the materials that it's right next to. The adjacent materials will get, type will transfer sometimes. The yellowing will damage photographs. You want to place newspaper clippings in clear polyester sleeves, and that will permit you to handle them more frequently because you're not actually touching the newspaper. And if it does start to crumble in that sleeve, it's at least held together and not become dust that's thrown out somewhere. You also want to think about how you're going to display and share these wonderful things that you found, right? You want to avoid displaying originals, right? You make a copy, put that in a frame, put that on the wall, because light exposure will accelerate that disintegration. Additionally, digitize everything. Digitize everything you find so that you can share it. Sharing is a way of preserving, because if you lose your stuff, maybe the person you shared it with, it still has it, can share it back with you. When you scan stuff, that's digitizing. Well, that's all that means, is that you're scanning something. You want to make sure you use a large enough scanner to cover the whole document and not have overhang, because if you close that lid, you're liable to break off important fragments of your paper, right? So you want to make sure you use a large enough scanner. And that's my notes about preservation on newspapers. So in summary, after collecting your census and vital records, you want to look through newspapers for sure. You want to locate the newspapers from the communities that you're interested in, where your family lived. I want you to consider reaching out to those historical societies and public libraries in the communities from which your ancestors came. Find out what they have. Ask the people who know. The librarians there will know. I want to remind you that not everything is online. Sometimes it's on microfilm. Sometimes you have to go to the place to look at it. But as black and white as newspapers are, they add a tremendous value of color to your family history narrative. So don't overlook them. Make sure you're using them. And with that, I am open to any questions you might have. Anyone?
Thanks, April. I'm going to stop the recording and then we'll do questions.
Great.
Okay. Stop.